Hello friends, I am Tarique, Faculty History at Vajiram and Ravi IAS Academy. We are going to discuss question paper 2022 History Optional. This is paper 2, section A, that is Modern Indian History. Now, what is very important thing for you to understand that the paper which has been asked this year and which UPSC is asking since last many years is exactly as per the pattern, as per the syllabus, and as what we are teaching here. If you're attending those classes regularly, taking our notes and handouts, and participating in discussions, you would not miss a single question which has been asked this year or last few years or going to be asked in 2023, 2024 or 2025. Now, there are certain basic rules for this exam, and I am sure you all are aware about it, that the syllabus is very well defined. The questions which they are asking is as per the standard of graduation, generally honors level of any standard Indian universities. Now, since we are aware about the standard and the pattern of both university as well as UPSC coaching institution, what you are going to learn from us, this is what very important, so that when you prepare, you should prepare exactly as required. Now, the first rule of this exam is that this exam is all about rule bound exam, that if you follow the instructions very carefully, you would not lose marks. For instance, one instruction is word limit. So if in a question, say question number 1, this is all 150 words, you should not exceed the word limit. 145 to 150, stop. No matter what you have left, because they are not going to tolerate an indisciplined student. Second rule about this exam is that the space which has been provided, don't write beyond that. Write within that space. They are very particular about it. Third, and that is also very important, of course, very much linked with the question, is that the question and the answer must have a direct linkage. You should not write what is called out of the box, something which has not been asked. So stick to the gun and stick to the question. Then every other thing also part of your preparation and part of your answer writing, that how you are organizing your points into thoughts and thoughts into points. What are your expression, how you are expressing in sentence form. Don't write in 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, D, bullet points. These are immature way of writing. It doesn't shows that you have understood the entire story and you just have mucked up some facts from here and there and you have written this one. That message should not be there. So think for few seconds before you start any question. It may take 2 minutes, sometimes 3 minutes, no harm in that. But organize those points in your mind. If possible, write somewhere in the rough page, and at that rough page itself, you restructure if you wish, that point number 3 you want to be at point number 1 or vice versa. So that when you start, your thought and your pen must have a coordination. And that is what all the question which they have asked is expressing. And they expect from you that the language which you are using should be simple, free from errors, whether grammatical errors, whether spelling errors, and it should be legible. There is no such thing called a very good handwriting or very bad handwriting. These are subjective. But what is legible, what is illegible, that is very much clear. So make sure that your handwriting, your font size, each one is readable. and get it checked from some seniors, preferably who is 10 to 15 years senior than you in that particular field, so that they can give right kind of comments. Each of these points which I have written from 1 to 6 are going to be very important in fetching very good marks. Many of my candidates, our candidate here in this academy, have got 280, 290, 300 plus, including this year topper. She got 306 in history. And not only in history, but because of her history, she also got good marks in GS and essay. So history preparation would help you in writing better answer of essay, GS, as well as in interview. So how this paper I'm going to deal and how you should prepare for your next year to next year, whichever you have decided. Let's start the first question. The Battle of Plassey, as you all know, 1757, was a skirmish, while the Battle of Buxar was a real war. Now, what is the demand of this question? This you have to understand that your answer must be demand driven rather than your answer should be resource driven. Generally, student write an answer resource driven. UPSC expect demand driven, that you heard about Plassey, you heard about Buxar, and you may know many such things about Plassey and Buxar. And that is the problem, that you may start with a sentence which is not needed. You may end which is not needed. So let's just see what is the demand of this question. The demand of this question is this. They are comparing two famous battles, Plassey and Buxar, in which the debate is this, that since Plassey was more a conspiracy, whereas Buxar was a true battle. Now, on what basis historians say this was not actually a battle, it was a treason, it was treachery? You all know that Mir Jafar, Jagat Seth, Amin Chand, Ghasiti Begum. You have to write these names also while writing your answer, so that the teacher who is checking your copy should understand that yes, you have the basic facts in your hand, in which you have to say that this battle, which lasted hardly few hours, and mostly it was a conspiracy in which the real army under the leadership of Mir Jafar did not fight. Whereas in Buxar, three Indian rulers, and you have to name those three Indian rulers, that is Nawab of Bengal, Nawab of Awadh, and Mughal King Shah Alam II. And they fought against a private company, English East India Company, and they were defeated at Buxar in 1764. Now, what was shocking in that Buxar was that it was a private army, three Indian rulers, including Mughal king. So it was a defeat of India in 18th century. The defeat reflects that how in generalship, how in leadership, how in technology, how in tactics, how in war strategies and planning, how in kits of armed forces, each one were outdated. And you have to mention all these terms which I have just used. Of course, in the class, we give in details, in dictations, in handouts. Here I am just trying to tell you what is the demand of the question and how you should approach. So East India Company completely outplayed Indian team, three Indian, and don't forget, it was not England which defeated them. It was a private company of England which defeated. That further shocking and reflects that how India in 18th century was different from India in 17th and 16th century. You all know that technology and development is very relative. So India was very modern relatively in 17th century, but from mid of 18th century, India started slipping, and there are various factors behind it. That, of course, you should know that. In our classes, we discuss that one. We give in handouts what are those points because of which India was defeated. And it is not only one defeat. If you look at the Maratha, the Mysores, the Punjab, almost all Indian rulers were defeated. They were forced to sign subsidiary alliance, except Mysore under Hyder and Tipu Sultan, who gave what is called some, honorable challenge and resistance. No other Indian ruler at that time was in a position to give this challenge. That is the issue here discussed. So Buxar today, maybe tomorrow, they can ask about Marathas, they can ask about Punjab, they can ask about Mysore also, and the story would remain same, that what went wrong with India in 18th century, because of which India slipped into the hands of a foreign country, that too a private company of a foreign country. This was the demand of the question, which you have to approach as I just told. Now we are going to discuss question number 1B. And as you can see, the Treaty of Amritsar, very important treaty in modern Indian history in 1809, was significant for its immediate as well as potential effects. So focus on some of the key words. What is the significance of this treaty exactly after 1809 and in the long term? This is the demand of the question. First, you have to mention the treaty exactly as happened in 1809 between Maharaja Ranjit Singh and East India Company. There is a slight background of this treaty. The British were eyeing towards Punjab for a very long time. One reason, obviously, Punjab is one of the most prosperous state in history. Keep that in your mind. If required, write it. Second important point was, strategically, Punjab had always been important in history, right from ancient till date. Afghanistan is very near, and just above Afghanistan, Russians. And Russians desired to control entire Central Asia. And the Russians, British and other Europeans were always fighting in those days. So it was a part of a larger game of the British how to control Punjab directly or indirectly. In the beginning, East India Company was not very strong. So obviously they were not directly attacking or not directly capturing any Indian territories. You must have read Subsidiary Alliance. And that was the time when Subsidiary Alliance was in full swing after Lord Wellesley. So in 1809, Maharaja Ranjit Singh was literally compelled to sign because East India Company's army had come up to Ludhiana. And don't forget, undivided Punjab means Lahore was their capital. Now, these are some strategies British adopted to first put a pressure through their armed forces and then literally pressurizing them to sign a treaty. Unfortunately, our Indian rulers did not show vision and long-term gain and losses when they were signing a particular treaty. This, of course, in our classes we discuss in more detail. So Maharaja Ranjit Singh also signed on a very important document in which he agreed that Satluj River would be the boundary line. Now, strategically speaking, that Satluj River, the moment they agreed as a boundary line, it was like advantage East India Company. And in that treaty, what happened? That he agreed that he would not send his army beyond a particular point as well as beyond a particular purpose in that region. So that means in future, East India Company would now start bargain from Satluj onwards. And just to make him, happy, East India Company said, you would be our most favored country, like in modern time, most favored nation status. And they promised we would not interfere in your internal matters, etc. And since Indian rulers were always afraid of another Indian rulers, so they assured a kind of assistance if it is needed. And they also agreed that they would not, if violate, this treaty would remain null and void. Now, the moment the state of Punjab, led by Ranjit Singh, signed, they lost a prospect. The prospect was that Ranjit Singh had a desire of a larger Sikh kingdom in the entire part of Punjab, which is now in India as well as in Pakistan. That hope is now dashed. Second, his entire control over Punjab would not be only his control. Now another company is coming and they can, in future claim from Satluj onwards. These are the losses immediately. Gains, Punjab now could gain something in the west of Punjab rather than in the east. So in the next few years, like in 1818, they captured Multan. In 1819, they captured Kashmir. In 1834, they captured Peshawar. These are some immediate gains which you have to mention. What are the long-term losses? As I told, that East India Company now started penetrating in that territory through its military and intelligence, and one big damage they did in 1835 when they built a cantonment at Firozpur. Now, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, of course, opposed, but by the time English had got more confidence, it was 1835, not 1809. And when you read history of East India Company, how they were growing leap and bound during this period from Lord Hastings to Lord William Bentinck period. So obviously, overconfident East India Company now established cantonment at Firozpur. So what you would find that in 1840s, Punjab became very vulnerable. And the fact that two Anglo-Punjab wars took place in this decade, 1845-46 and 48-49, and ultimately Punjab was the next. So the seat of final loss of Punjab to East India Company had actually been sown in 1809. Now, that is the point which I told they did not have the vision what would happen in the next few years or decades. So biggest criticism of Maharaja Ranjit Singh is that he yielded too much in this treaty, did not show the vision and wisdom of that this treaty actually was in favor of East India Company. Company did not lose by this treaty. Yes, Maharaja and Punjab lost. So in history of modern India, this treaty is regarded as one of a treaty in which the Raja was blamed for yielding too much, not showing vision. This is what the demand you have to write. Now we are going to discuss question number 1C. What is the demand of the question? Famines were not just because of food grain scarcity, but were direct result of colonial economic policies. Now this question is based on a debate. The debate was between colonial writers, that is the English historians, and Indian historians. Not only this, but the government of the time and the nationalists of the time also had disagreement on this issue. The basic difference was that the British believed that nature was the reason for all the famine in India. Second reason they said was growing population in India. The Indian nationalists, you all heard about Dadabhai Nauroji, R.C. Dutt, R.P. Dutt, Dinshaw Vacha, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, G.V. Joshi. They all wrote in late 19th and early 20th century. They argued that the famine in ancient period and in medieval period was not as frequent and not at that scale as it happened in modern period. Whereas natural calamities happened in those period also. That means it was something to do with the policies of the British or the colonial system. Now, I have divided into two types of policies. One which I call action and one is called inaction. So the action part of the British, which was responsible, was like their land revenue policy. They collected very high rate of land revenue. That means the farmers were very poor. So even a mild drought can make them impoverished because their purchasing power was very low. Then the government policies often in terms of collection of food and supplying to another places led to shortage at a particular place. And if it is related to war, for instance, World War I, World War II, and what happened during that period, they supplied the food grains from one area to another, like the most famous during Second World War, the food from Eastern Bengal was supplied to Burma, where the British Army were fighting against the Japanese. And that led to sudden shortage of rice. And of course, the people did not have also means to move from one place to another because most of these places had small islands, and the British also burned the boats with the fear that if the Japanese come, they may use that one. So many people were trapped in a small islands and they did not have means to move out, did not have food to eat, which led to death of millions of people in 1943-44 in Bengal. Who is responsible, nature or the government? That is the question. So this is called policy oriented factors for the regular occurrence of famine. In our classes, we give a list of almost 15 major famines in India, two very notorious in 1876-78, and one was in 1943-44. Of course, in between also, there were a lot of famines occurred in British India. Now, what were the inaction? Inaction means that the government which was supposed to act, for instance, during famine, did they work for relief work? Hardly. Did they work for rehabilitation? Hardly. Did they provide food on time when needed? Despite the fact they had railways, they had post and telegraph, they had better intelligence, when there was a revolt or a possible revolt, they could reach their resources very quickly. But when there was famine, drought, people were dying, their resources did not reach very quickly. That means their intention was not there. This is what inaction. Now, these are the points which, if you have understood, then only you can write it, because all the questions which they have asked and they are asking is extempore type answer. Means you understood it, you have the basic facts, figures, data, names in your mind, and when you get the question, think for 1 minute to 2 minutes, organize in your mind, write in some rough page if required, and then start writing. Let me clarify, this type of question does not require that your answer should match exactly with the answer of your another colleague, another batchmate. 10 students may write in 10 different ways, but the crux must be the same. The concept must be the same, which I have already told. Most of that, like action and inaction, and how the government policies are responsible rather than the nature. Nature might have started, but it was complicated by man and definitely by the colonial rule. For instance, just giving an example, after 1947 till 2022, we did not have any major kind of famine, though we had all the time some kind of natural calamities at some part of India. During British time also, India was very big, bigger than current India. And Indian geographical condition is such that entire India would not have a similar kind of weather in a day or a month or a season, which means if there was a drought in one area, there was a good harvest in another area. So a good, sensible, smart government and administration could have quickly compensated the shortage of food and the resources, which we did after independence. Like we have PDS schemes, we have various kind of other help which, if needed, the state and its apparatus can provide and do provide. This is what you should have understood it, then you could have attempted this question. Let's see next question, that is question number 1D. penetration of outsiders called Dikus by the Santals completely destroyed their familiar world and forced them into action to take possessions of their lost territory. Now, what is the issue here? Not only in Santhal, but in all the tribal areas. Again, in our classes, we discuss all these issues. Santhal and Mundas uprising are the two most famous uprising of 19th century. But there are many more tribal uprisings in colonial period. Here you have to understand it's not only the British who were responsible. Here it is a modern what is called capitalist economy which is responsible. It is the human desires, and I would even go further, human lust, which is reason for all the problems in tribal area. You have to see like this, the world of tribals before 18th century was totally different. They were enjoying life with nature. They had a concept called sustainable development. They may not know the term sustainable development, but they had the consciousness that we should use what is needed and leave it for the generation next or for the nature itself, because they loved forest, they loved animals, they loved all the natural creation on the planet. Now, in 18th century, a new economic world order emerged, capitalism and industrial revolution. In India also it started showing its ugly face. So a lot of outsiders it started penetrating in the tribal area. Who are these outsiders? They were the peasants of plain area. They were traders of plain area. They were money lenders, they were zamindars, they were contractors, they were government officials, they were teachers, they were doctors. They all were outsiders. And those Santhal were living with their primitive way of agriculture. They knew agriculture, small cottage industries, forest and forest product, very happy with their language, with their culture, with their own world, with their own songs, with their own festivals, with their own food, with their own faith. Now, each of these are going to be attacked by these people who claim themselves as more civilized, more modern, and obviously they got the backing of state, and that is where the Santhal or any tribals were at receiving end. And slowly, by the end of 19th century, a complete world they started living. And the new world is that world of rules, world of laws. These laws came from the so-called civilized world by the parliaments of England, by the Indian legislative councils and executives, and these Santhals and tribals were totally unaware that their lands are taken by these people, transferred to them, their forest right was given to them, and they themselves had to live on the mercy of all these outsiders. Except teachers and doctors, all those who came, they all took something. The teachers and doctors in return gave something, that is some education or some medicine, etc. But if you look at the other people whom I have mentioned, they all had taken. So when the Santhals or the Mundas or any tribals were fighting, actually, and most of their fight you would find very violent. Still in Naxal belts, the tribals are fighting very violent. In northeast, very violent. So what is the purpose of that one? They wanted to take back. They wanted to take possession of their lost territory. Lost territory does not only mean land. Lost territory here means with their familiar world, that is their lost language, their lost culture, and their lost faith. Their entire identity was at stake. And now they wanted, through whatever means, and obviously they had no other means, Like they were not so mature to go like Gandhian way of Satyagraha or some other political agitation like socialists did. But whatever they knew to survive and to protect their natural rights, they did it. And that is why it became very violent. This was the demand of the question. But that question also needed your holistic understanding of all these, which I just told. In our classes, we discuss it, and only our notes, handouts are enough. Of course, one standard textbook is always preferred, which we suggest. In our class, we also tell those. And then some practice with the help of faculties here, and you get your answers checked, corrected, marks with remarks, so that have you inserted the right points or not, have you given some wrong points, some wrong facts, your order is correct or not, your expression is correct or not. And as I told in the beginning, needed or not, whether the answer is as per the question or not. Now this question of within a limited scope, the question number 1E. Within a limited scope, the Indian scientist could pursue original scientific research during colonial India. Now, what is the demand of this question? The demand of this question is this, that in the British period, why we had limited research? First by the British themselves, then by the Indians. But Indians at least started doing some research despite limitation. So a little story you need to understand. Of course, here you do not have to write that story, but to make you understand that the British, when started modern education and Western education, they were very selective. They did not invest money in those research which was of no use for them, like physics and chemistry and mathematics directly, but they invested on surveys, on archaeologies, on botanies, on later on medical science, because this they needed for their economic resources to find out where the minerals, what are the agricultural resources, how to get variety of seeds for cotton and other cash crops. So agriculture science was promoted, botanical science was promoted, medical science, because the diseases which the soldiers were getting and the British officials, and since this is a tropical country, climate is different, so you would find they invested money in those areas. But they did not promote Indian scientists, and you would find a lot of Indian scientists were actually facing all kind of discrimination. Their history is full of biases and discrimination. But as we all know that when there is a will, there is a way. So some Indians who started despite limited fund, despite discouragement, despite lot of other hurdles created by the colonial rule, what you are supposed to know, that right from Raja Ram Mohan Roy to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to Imad Ali, the very early Indians who established some scientific institutions, like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan established in Aligarh in 1864, that is Aligarh Scientific Education Society. Imad Ali established in 1868, that is Bihar Scientific Society. And Raja Ram was the first who demanded that the British should spend money on scientific education, and he was the first Indian who directly wrote to British Queen about modern scientific education. He was unhappy when he heard that the traditional education would be promoted in India. And this you have to keep in your mind, the famous Anglicist versus Orientalist divide at that time. Although Raja Ram Mohan Roy died in 1833 and he did not see the famous Macaulay Minute of 1835, but he was concerned and he wanted modern scientific education. So you can start with these three names. Then some of the major scientific achievements by Indians in chronology, you can write it down, like M.L. Sarkar. In 1876, he established Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science at Calcutta. Jamshed Ratan Tata, not only an industrialist, but he was a philanthropist. He was very much eager for modern scientific institutions. Firstly, he worked in Bombay, and later on, it was his efforts and the efforts of some other Indian scientists which led to establishment of the famous Indian Institute of Science at Bangalore, which is at that time Bangalore in 1909. Now, many other Indian scientists, you all heard it in your school days, were actually product of the same period. J.C. Bose, who was not only a physicist but also a plant physiologist, and one of his contribution was that one of the earliest Indian who had an interdisciplinary approach, and that was obviously a credit goes to some Indian, Sir Asutosh Mukherjee. Now he established University College of Science, and don't forget, without colleges, university, and institutions, you cannot expect for scientific growth in any country. So some English individuals did on the basis of their own likes and dislikes, or they love the subject, but government of East India Company or government of British Crown actually were not very much interested. That is why the role of these people in establishing such institutions itself is very credible. That, while writing, keep in your mind. And this is the institution where P.C. Roy, C.V. Raman, S.N. Bose, and K.S. Krishna, the noted scientist in India, actually have taught. So that means a young generation of scientists who would work in the various scientific field that started in this period. You all heard about J.C. Bose, and famous for his work on plant tissues. S. Ramanujan, the great mathematicians of India who worked for number theory, that also you can write in your answer. P.C. Ray, a rare Indian minerals, he actually started, discovering and making use of that one. C.V. Raman, of course, you all know that he got Nobel Prize, scattering of light. P.L. Mahalanobis, he worked on statistics, and of course, S.N. Bose worked with the great Albert Einstein on elementary particles, and the famous Bose-Einstein statistics that you all heard it in your 10th and 12th is actually the work of the colonial period, that is in the first half of 20th century. So the second half of 19th century and the first half of 20th century was very productive as far as the colonial period in research and science. Now, one very famous scientist, M.N. Saha, had a very interesting belief, and he disputed with Mahatma Gandhi's thought. If you remember, Gandhi's thought was cottage industry, village economy. Now, Saha believed that this would not promote science and technology. So, if you want to promote science and technology, you have to promote industrialization. And many of them, including Jawaharlal Nehru, were actually very much inspired by Russian development, if you look at from 1917 onwards, and that is the time when these people were active. So they wanted that science and technology, industrial revolution, and national development all are connected. So the nationalist movement also inspired these people to work for science and technology. Of course, Gandhian way was slightly different than, say, Nehruvian way. Nehru was more inclined towards socialist economy, and after 1927 Brussels Congress, when he came back, he wanted a Russian model, Japanese model economy, in which science and technology is very important. And obviously, scientists like Saha and many other who also loved their subjects and knew that the progress and future of a country is directly linked with the modern science and technology. This topic is very interesting. All you needed is to read properly, understand it, and some basic facts, but mostly it is a very thoughtful question which I hope you have understood. Let's see another question. And this question is that explain how the permanent settlement, this is question 2A. Question 2A. explain how the permanent settlement initiated a rule of property in Bengal and what were its consequences. Now, there are many changes brought by British economic policies. Now, one of their economic policy was related to revenue settlement. Within revenue settlement, permanent settlement, Rayatwari settlement, Mahalwari settlement. Now, two settlements are more famous, controversial, the first two, and often they ask questions from either of the two areas. So, this time they ask from permanent settlement. Now, in permanent settlement, there are many features. One of the feature was that the zamindar was made owner of the land. Now, the very concept of property after that changed, because in medieval time, when we read Abul Fazl, Aine Akbari and Akbarnama, Aine Akbari is part of Akbarnama, in which it is clearly stated that the Mughals treated the peasant as owner. Now, when the British came, and during Warren Hastings period, that is 1772 to 85, and then Lord Cornwallis period from 1786 to 1793, the debate started who were the owners. Now, Lord Cornwallis believed the zamindars were owner, which was his mistake, and they started treating them as owner, and peasants were reduced as tenant on his own land. Now, zamindar, if failed to collect land revenue, that is tax, rent from the peasant, he had a right to evict the farmer from the land, because in 1794 they made another law which is popularly called as Sunset Law, under which if zamindar failed to deposit land revenue on time, the state can evict zamindar also. So to protect his own skin, he would do everything to collect rent from the peasant and then pay tax to the government or to the government of East India Company. So that means that here they had established a dual ownership. Now, what is dual ownership? Between peasant and zamindar, the zamindar was owner. But between zamindar and state, the state was owner. Now, this was totally different from the England and other European countries. So, this is one part of the question. Now, what were its consequences? The consequences are plenty. Few of the consequences is that the peasants were now reduced. They were reduced as what is called tenant at will. They were reduced as sharecroppers in some places. They were reduced as landless laborers in many places. Another impact, since zamindari right itself was not permanent, so what happened? Lot of absentee landlordism emerged. Those who were not living in village but living in cities, they were merchant, they started getting the right of zamindari because the old zamindar failed. So you would find in Bengal, Bihar and Odisha in the late 18th and early 19th century two very important phenomena. One is transfer of land, that from peasant the land started transferring to zamindar. Two, the old zamindars were replaced by the new zamindars called absentee landlords, which itself had a lot of other problem. For instance, old zamindar at least had some sympathy with the peasants. They were grown together, they played together, they could have given some concessions at the time of collection of revenue. New zamindar is not living in the village, they were traders, so obviously they had no emotional connect with the peasant, unlike old zamindar. Secondly, new zamindars were well settled in cities like Calcutta, Dhaka, Murshidabad, Patna, They appointed their agents, and those agents would collect land revenue on behalf of that zamindar who is in the city. So what would happen? Sometimes agents would appoint sub-agents. So there would be intermediaries between state, then zamindar, then agent, then sub-agent, and then the farmers. Obviously, each one are taking their cut, their share. The entire burden is on the farmers. Another big impact out of this ownership was, since the peasants were reduced to this, so the role of money lenders also increased. And obviously, in every villages of eastern India, at least one or two money lenders would be there, and they would give loan on interest. So the peasants had now to face two villains in the villages: a zamindar, old or new, or a money lender. Obviously, it led to poverty, that is one impact. It led to transfer of land, that is another impact. It led to stagnation in agriculture because the peasant did not have anything to invest. The zamindars, absentee or present, not interest, neither the government. So agricultural production would remain stagnant. But the population, obviously, at whatever rate, like 3% per annum, was rising. So over a period of time, shortage of food. Now, this is also going to link with the famine. And then the British said it was the population which was rising. Actually, population was rising at its natural speed. Agricultural production should have also risen at its natural speed. This did not happen. This stopped. So that rise looks very big rise, and that is why the British claim is wrong and the nationalist claim is right, that it is your economic policy. So there are certain policies which you have to understand with great depth. Once you understand, you can handle multiple questions. As I told, a question like famine and a question like impact of permanent settlement are how interconnected. So this is how you should have approached this question, and I'm sure in our classes you would attend all these topics with greater clarity as well as with right material. Now, another debatable question which UPSC is asking every year on such issues in which you would find two opinions and people are divided within scholars, like, was the Western education a harbinger of cultural awakening or an instrument of colonial hegemony? If you remember, on 15th of August 2022, our Prime Minister from Red Fort, Delhi, told that we must free from colonial hangover or colonial mindset. Now, this debate is very long. I remember in my college days also, this was debated and we used to participate in our debate whether Western education actually modernized Indians or westernized Indian. Now, the debate is this, that what is the purpose of Western education? Obviously, there is no doubt in that the purpose of the Western education was not to modernize us, not to civilize us, not to make India a great nation. The purpose was to help the colonial interest, and it could be served in different ways. They needed some clerks, they needed some officials. So they had to give some educations to the Indians, not with the purpose of modernizing and civilizing them. But the moment they introduced modern natural science, that is physics, chemistry, bio, modern social sciences, that is history, geography, political science, sociology, psychology, and modern economics, etc. And the moment they introduce modern literature, that is novels, short stories, poetries, satires, this all would at least create a section of Indians whom you can call enlightened, because they are those who started using their mind. And once you are impacting the mind of a person and allowing them to think rationally, logically, then you cannot stop them. And that exactly the British did not realize in the beginning, that the purpose of their education was actually to make us more and more slave. The very famous statement of Lord Macaulay in 1835, that you should keep in your mind while writing, and if needed you can quote, that through this education we want to create an Indian who by color and taste remains an Indian, who color and skin remains an Indian, but by thought and taste becomes an English. Now, that was the famous statement of Lord Macaulay. But he also perhaps did not realize that once you are giving education of these subjects, at least a section of Indians who started studying, say, logic, rationality, observation, scientific inquiry, liberty, equality, fraternity, idea of justice, idea of citizenship. This all from French and other revolution. Now you cannot stop them, that they would ask the same thing from the colonial masters, and that exactly the point, that was it a harbinger of cultural awakening. And now they started asking about themselves, who am I, why our conditions are so poor, why our society is so orthodox, superstitions, and a tradition which was going on, say sati, say widows were not allowed to remarry, say child marriage, say various other atrocities including untouchability. This was going on since centuries, but now they started questioning that the same thing which was a ritual, now it looks a problem. Now it looks like a superstitious and dogmatic things. That happened because of the awakening. Of course, the British education helped in making us realize that these are the problems. But there is the other side also, there is a flip side also of this story. The other side is that what Macaulay wanted, as he said in 1835, he also succeeded, that we got a section of Indians who started believing that British are superior, that their civilization, that their culture, that their dress, that their language, everything is superior than us. And they started, praising and supporting the British rule. In that case, he succeeded. And there is no doubt in this fact that a lot of Indians in the early days of nationalist movement also were supporters of British rule, including people like Dadabhai Naoroji. But very soon, since they were educated, better than others, they realized that the British rule is not good for Indian economy, Indian people. And Dadabhai Naoroji, in his article 1867, very famous, that is English Debt to India, and then his famous book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, he called the British rule despotic. He called the British rule righteous. He called the British rule as plunderer. And he was writing in India and in England and writing so boldly, British as plunderer, not so easy even in modern time in many countries. That was a sign of that awakening. So not only social reforms, it also became a basis of nationalist ideology. And the very formation of Indian National Congress is linked with Western education. Some people call it modern education, some people call it Western education. That debate, let it be, but I hope you understood the entire demand of this question, what was expected, and you're supposed to write. 2C, another interesting question. Can you explain how acquiring Diwani, the government of East India Company, functioned like an Indian ruler? Now, the period between 1765 to 1772 is actually the demand of the question, because the Diwani right, they got it through Treaty of Allahabad. That, of course, you all would read, some of you might have read, between Mughal King Shah Alam II and East India Company. Now, there are many other clauses, but Diwani right means that right to collect land revenue and other revenues were in the hands of company. So how the system was worked under dual government, that first you have to explain briefly. That the Diwani right was in the hands of East India Company, whereas the Nizamat right was in the hands of Nawab, and company worked with the help of two Dipti Diwans. Now these two Dipti Diwan, Raja Shitab Rai and Riza Khan, they were appointed by Nawab, but they worked for East India Company. So this is one of the way that now they are working as an Indian ruler, though this company came first as a trader, not as a ruler. But since they got Diwani, and Diwani collection means that Lagan collection or other indirect collection, and company had no experience as well as no staff or technical people to understand the nuances of trade, the nuances of tax collection, and that too Lagan type, which was very complex. So they used initially the services of Indians in Diwani collection, but not only in revenue administration, they worked as an Indian ruler, but Nawab was completely under the control of East India Company in all the matters of administration, law and order, in the matters of appointment, transfer, or removal of any officials. So company was not directly ruling. Company was ruling with the help of Nawab. And the Nawabs after Plassey and Buxar were completely demoralized and they became puppets. So this was the time in Bengal, Bihar and Odisha where company theoretically was a trading company, practically was an Indian ruler in Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. And that is what the question which any student who have understood this topic in our classes can easily write. Of course, you need to practice something, you need to remember some of the facts and figures as I mentioned. 3A. Do you think that Indian national movement was a multi-class movement which represented the anti-imperialist interest of all classes and strata? Give reasons in support of your answer. Now, this question again is based on a debate. What is the debate? Our Indian nationalists of all phases, whether moderates or extremist or Gandhian phases, they believe that these movements are for all Indians. It may not have been led by all, but it was always led for all. When Gandhi came in Indian politics and became more active after 1919, 1920, the entire politics of India, the structure of Congress and the nationalist movement changed. And what was that biggest change? Now, our nationalist movement became, it was led by all and led for all. Before Gandhi, it was like led by few but led for all. And how to prove it? How to give your argument? The best argument in the first phase and the Gandhian phase both is that see the resolutions of Congress. Right from the first session, Congress started asking demands related to all class, multi-class. They were asking about peasants when they asked reduce land revenue. They were asking about workers when they were asking to protect Indian industries. They were asking about peasants and workers when they were asking to implement famine code. They were asking about all Indians when they asked to check drain of wealth. And as you know, the drain of wealth demand started since 1893 when Dadabhai Naoroji was president. They asked about the demands like representation of Indians in parliament at that time called imperial council, legislative councils. Obviously they would raise questions about all Indian. So in those houses elite would go. That happens everywhere. The first who would benefit from any such political change would be the upper strata of the society. And Lord Dufferin had called early Congress people as an organization of microscopic minority. And that debate, which continued for a very long time in history, that Congress was, nationalist movement was a microscopic minority, or it was for multi-class movement, or it was for all Indians. So much so that in the post Second World War, the English authors, one very famous Cambridge scholar, Anil Seal, he also argued in the book Emergence of Indian Nationalism the same theory that actually this Congress was not meant for all classes. It was always a bourgeois party. That was also an accusation by some leftist Marxist scholars that the peasants and workers were left behind, even in Mahatma Gandhi, and they had a separate movements led by, say, communist movement and socialist movement, the peasants movement, the trade union movement, and Gandhi and Congress just used them in their popular movements for certain political gains, did not do much structural change as far as the demands of the peasant, for instance. They argued that Gandhi did not demand abolishment of zamindari system for a very long time, which is a fact. And Gandhi started asking abolishment only in the late 30s and early 40s. But you have to also understand that Gandhi wanted to strike a balance between the two extremes. He didn't want revolutions like Russia and China. He didn't want class struggle. He didn't want caste conflict. He didn't want religious conflict. He wanted to strike a balance so that every class get their due respect, position and justice, and the richer and the powerful had to compromise more than the poor and the weaker. That is what in Gandhian philosophy and movement you would find. So the theory is entirely based on this argument that nationalist versus imperialist scholars, then Gandhian versus the Marxist scholars, and this entire question is based on this one. So in the later phase, right from say 1920s to 30s to 40s, when you see the progress of non-cooperation to civil disobedience to quit India, in between Bardoli Satyagraha and many other movements, you will find that it was a multi-class movement. Okay, it was represented by all, and they had anti-imperialist interests. So there were two types of clash going on. One was it was anti-British, but also it was sometimes anti-zamindar, anti-mahajan, anti-capitalist. So conflict in India would be of two types. One, Indians versus British, and one, Indians versus Indians, because of inequality, because of caste and untouchability, because of majority minority issue, because of orthodox and liberal conflicts. So these are realities of India before independence and after independence. So this question demands that you should have understood the current as well as undercurrents of Indian politics and Indian social issues of that period. Then you could have handled this at much ease. All the questions are thoughtful. Few facts you need, but how to start, how to progress, how to end, it's all up to you. It's like an open field. They have not told you that you start from this line and end from this line. You understand the modern history properly. You keep some basic facts, figure, data, name, place in your hand. Use it smartly, intelligently, wisely, as and when required. Don't use it if it is not required. And for that, you have to, of course, practice. We will help you how to do that also. Now, see the next question, 3B. The British rule had differential impact on the Indian society. Describe in what ways the Indians responded to the revolt of 1857. Question had been asked several times in different ways that how the soldiers were unhappy during British period, right? And what were the reason for their unhappiness? You have to give 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 reasons. One reason, of course, the use of fatty substance in the making of grease cartridges, cow and pig. Soldiers were not paid equally with the English soldiers. Chances of their promotion was very limited. They were posted abroad, and obviously they were unhappy upper caste Hindus. Then allowances were not paid as per the promise. Then they were humiliated. So that part you have to write, that differential impact on Indian society. So briefly about soldiers. Then the social impact of their economic policy. Now, in economic policy, how the people became poor, how they became unemployed thanks to their revenue policy, whether it is permanent settlement, whether it is Rayatwadi, whether it is Mahalwadi. And what you notice that these poor unemployed became an important players during the revolt of 1857 because large number of farmers were also joining this one. Then many Orthodox Hindus were worried because of the progressive laws which the British had passed in the last few decades. 1829 Anti-Sati Law, then you heard it, the child marriage was banned, then you must have heard this female feticide, then you must have heard this Widow Remarriage Act, etc. Now, many Hindus believe that it is an interference of their religion, of their caste, and of their customs. Of course, we know that these are progressive laws. Many Indians like Rajaram to Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar supported it. But at that time, the size of Orthodox was much more than the size of liberals. So they were unhappy and they also joined, right? Then Muslim elite, they were also impacted by the British because after 1837, when English became official language, removing Persian, so the Muslim elite who enjoyed important positions and powers and glory during the Mughal time, late Mughal time, now it is replaced by a new elite, and those elites are first the English and then some Hindu elite. Now, Muslims elite were slow in learning English, and they also joined this revolt when revolt started with the thinking that we may get our lost position, lost power, and lost glory. Then you would find a section of Muslims called Wahhabis, very radical groups who wanted first in Punjab and Northwest Frontier Province to establish what is called Darul Islam, land of Islam. And they started a guerrilla fight in 1820s, 30s and 40s. But after 1849, when Punjab was annexed, their fight was directly with the British. And in 1857, they became very active and they supplied their men as well as material during the revolt of 1857. You must have heard about Maulvi Ahmadullah of Faizabad, Maulvi Pir Ali of Patna. They were actually Wahhabi leaders. And because they had declared it as jihad, which is wrongly translated in English as holy war, but the word jihad stands for a struggle. But they thought that we are doing it for the cause of God, cause of Allah. Whether it was really cause of God or Allah, that is a different matter. But it actually helped in uniting a section of Muslims, young Muslims, who got some physical training and who had some mental training, that we have to fight against the British and we are doing it for the cause of God. So that gave a huge energy in this revolt, and that is what the question is, that in what way the Indians responded to the revolt. So these are different sections of Indians who responded in Awadh to Bihar, to certain part of central India, to Delhi. Of course, it was triggered by the soldiers. So it is again based on the same old question, that was it a mutiny or was it a popular revolt? As Bipan Chandra called, this was actually a popular revolt. As Irfan Habib says, it was a national revolt. Even Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, called it as a national uprisings. Yes, some English called it Sepoy Mutiny, some called it only a conspiracy between English and the Muslims, etc. But a lot of research in the last 40, 50 years have shown that it actually was a powerful response and reaction of Indians, including, say, lower middle class people who were affected by the corruptions of the administration. They were not necessarily fighting against the British Empire, but they may be fighting against local SHO or local tehsildars or patwaris, who were the direct site of their corruptions, and they attacked those people. So the history of 1857 is very interesting study in modern history. A lot of research paper is still needed and is still going on, but so far whatever was asked, I hope it is clear. 3C, analyze how the revolutionaries, also called militant nationalists, right, taught people self-confidence and widened the social base of the freedom movement. So you heard about moderates, extremists, Gandhian, but there was another parallel movement called revolutionaries, called militant nationalists. The British called them terrorists, which of course you shall not. Some earlier historians called them as revolutionary terrorists. I would suggest even don't use this one. These two are better. That is why even the question has not used that one. Who are these people? They were mostly young people, because it would be related to violence and it would be related to anger. So obviously it would be a movement of people from 16 to 30s, not beyond that, by and large. Now what is the question? The question demands two important points: self-confidence and how they widen the social base. Now let's start self-confidence. One of the biggest problem with common Indian, that they had a fear of losing whether life, property, job, or their day-to-day routine. These revolutionaries taught common people that fear is your enemy, and it is that fear because of which the British are ruling and doing injustice. So when they attacked some person, like Rands was killed in 1897, like Kingsford was attacked in 1908 at Muzaffarpur, like Governor General Lord Hardinge was attacked in Delhi, Chandni Chowk in 1912 by a group of revolutionaries led by Raj Bihari Bose. Bhagat Singh and his comrades attacked many such people, and it is believed that in 1928 they killed Sanders. They threw bomb in 1929 assembly, Bhagat Singh and Batukeshwar, that you all know very well, against the two laws, two bill which was pending. What was that element which they brought? That do not fear. Secondly, you as an Indian do not feel that you are inferior. The British always claim that the white race is superior, you Indian are inferior. Now, they were educated also, some of them, like Bhagat Singh and his friends, were highly educated. They started talking about state which should be secular, socialist, democratic, republic. This was the objective of HSRA, Hindustan Socialist Republican Association at Delhi. Now, this started giving them confidence that, okay, we are not inferior, okay, there is no point of having a fear. And with their pamphlets, with their newspapers, with their posters, with their actions, these are the points which you have to mention, as I told. They taught the people that you must have confidence about your Indianness, about your identity. Another important point is that once these people raise the issues of workers, raise the issues of peasants, raise the issues of poor, demanded a secular state, they actually widened the scope of freedom struggle, because the allegation of the moderate Congress as well as some extremist and Gandhian Congress was that it was led by middle class, middle educated class, mostly urban. Of course, that blame cannot go to Gandhi, but they were not completely concerned about the workers and peasants. That was definitely an allegation. These people got support of this class, for instance, in trade union movement during a strike, etc. They would support. So they widen the social base, right? Another interesting thing about these revolutionaries that they use slogans and symbols of all religion or mostly secular, like Inqalab Zindabad, Mera Rang De Basanti. They always had people of mixed caste. They always had people of mixed class and mixed religion and mixed region. So if you look at that HRA as well as HSRA, you would find people of different caste, class, region, religion. This is what the question demand: widen the social base of freedom movement. Discuss the policies and programs of early nationalists, that is the moderates. To what extent, this is question 4a, to what extent they were able to fulfill the aspirations of the people. This actually demands that the moderates' demands in the first 20 years, which you have to write, that they wanted more Indians in the assemblies, councils. They wanted reforms in civil services. They wanted separation of judiciary from executive. They wanted tax should be reduced. They wanted Indian industries should be protected. They wanted famine code to be implemented. They wanted freedom of speech and thought. These are the demands in the early days of the Congress, not Swaraj, not Purn Swaraj. Now, how they asked this one? They asked through meetings, prayers, petitions, representations, articles writing in a very soft language. This is what their policies. Programs, I have already told. How much they succeeded in fulfilling the aspiration of the people? In the beginning, this movement was not very big because it was led by few, not led for few, led for all, led by few. But it created awareness, it created some patriotic feelings, and it indulged some youth in the cities at least. Now, many of the demands which they raised was hardly fulfilled. By that logic, they failed to get what they wanted. But at least some concessions they got in bargain, like 1892 Indian Council Act, through which they got indirect election, 1909 Indian Council Act, through which they got direct elections. Now, these are like some of the aspirations, at least of middle class, they got it. But what is the point is that government now started listening because of their regular pressure, movement, petitions, writings, etc. And what they did, India benefited in 1920s, 30s and 40s. Even leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, Subhash, Maulana benefited from the works of the early nationalists. With that approach, you should address this question rather than directly write that they failed to get what they wanted or they failed to fulfill the aspiration of the people. So a little twist you have to give it, because they were working for Indians. Their strategy in the beginning was go slow, steadily, because British were very powerful, and they also realized that mass base has yet to be created, and that is why their acceptance would be limited. That was the demand of this question. Now, in the light, question number 4b, in the light of contentions over McMahon Line, very controversial, analyze the India-China relation in the 1950s and 60s, 2 decades. You have to describe what is McMahon Line in very brief, that 24th, 25th March 1914. This was in Shimla, convention, India and Tibet. Don't forget, at that time Tibet was an autonomous region. Had signed a very long border, almost 890 kilometers in the north of Bhutan to Ishurazi Pass. It stretches just north of Arunachal Pradesh. What is India's stand? That you have to write it down. That India accept McMahon Line as the legal border between India and China. What is China's stand? China says that Tibet was not official or not a country. It was a part of our territory, and who were they to sign when we were not signing? So they refused to accept that McMahon Line. And from that point of time till date, the problem continues that they have not accepted, and they started claiming entire our Arunachal Pradesh as part of China. Now, you have to understand this topic, how the world changed before World War II and after World War II. After World War, Chinese Revolution came in 1949, and that created what is called People's Republic of China. Now, the communism was a big threat for America and Western countries at that time. So obviously, they were not ready to accept China as a country. India was one of the first country on 1st January 1950 recognized China. Now, this is the point, one of the important policy of Jawaharlal Nehru's government, that China is our neighbor. Let's accept it as a sovereign nation, so that whatever issues we have bilateral as well as regional, we can resolve only when you give a respect to China. The other part of the world, particularly the Western worlds, have humiliated, neglected China for a very long time. And that is going to impact our foreign policy in 1950s, 60s, and our relationship between India and China. Keep that in your mind. So 1954, a very famous Panchsheel program of Jawaharlal Nehru, that, focusing on China and India relationship, that is called mutual respect, mutual non-aggression, equality between the two, would respect sovereignty of each other. Now, these are all very powerful principle on which India's foreign policy was based for a very long time. And China also responded in the beginning. Till 1959, nobody knew and thought that China would actually betray India. So till 1950s, our relation was smooth. Of course, Chinese did not recognize McMahon Line, but they always said that we will discuss this later on. Let's continue. That was the attitude. So our foreign policy was also based on that. But 1962 attack of China over India, particularly in the eastern sector, came up to Assam, surprise, shocked the entire nation, and they captured certain part, as you know, a very huge territory in Ladakh region also. That you have to write briefly. But in the policy part, what you are supposed to actually write, that it was in the context of Cold War, USSR and USA, and China was a major power. India and China are two newly developed countries, developing countries, what is called. And now India has to play very safely, that India did not want to hurt the neighbors as well as the communists as well as the capitalists. So the NAM policy, you all heard it, comes into play. But when India was attacked, India asked help from USA and UK. And that is also a question by some critique, that how much non-alignment was really practical. If it was, then why India asked help from USA as well as UK? They of course responded positively. So the foreign policy of India in the 1950s, 60s related to China has to be seen in China's isolation, and sometime when a country is isolated, wanted to assert itself to show that we are arriving, we are powerful, you accept us, you recognize us. So many scholars see Chinese aggression in that context rather than a failure of India's foreign policy, which many Indians at that time, whether right-wing groups or left-wing group, all attacked Jawaharlal Nehru up to the level that his favorite defense minister Krishna Menon had to resign, and there was a no confidence motion on Jawaharlal Nehru in the parliament. That all shows that how Indians were also thinking that Jawaharlal Nehru's foreign policy was responsible for the failure. But you have to read this in international context, the Cold War context, the NAM context, the communist rise in the eastern sector of Asia context, then you understand Nehru's foreign policy in a proper way. So was India, or did India misread China? That is a question which is left for you at the end. So in my personal opinion, at that time, it was very tricky situation for India. India itself was a new nation, and India did not want to confront, because Pakistan had already started a war in 1947-48, and the Pakistani establishment were continuously, attacking in different ways. India did not want to open another frontier with China. So India wanted to go with China a little softer. And it is not like a failure of India's military and military preparation. All these are wrongs. India, with the same military preparation, Defense, Air Force, Army, Air Force, Navy, defeated Pakistan in 1965. So that shows that the problem was more about diplomacy as well as foreign policy. This, of course, in our classes we deal little more in details. Then, 4C, how did the popular movements help us to understand the nature of environmental crisis in post-colonial India? Now, environment is going to be a very important topic in the next few years, whether British period, post-independent. That is the first point. Second point is that environmental movement in the West and environmental movement in the East, especially in India, is slightly different. Here, we find it was always a grassroots level, from villages, from the tribals. So it was not like from the elite who started, the common people who started. That is the first important point. Mahatma Gandhi, for many scholars, including Ramchandra Guha, actually was a great environmentalist. Though he did not directly launch any movement as such, but simple life, his ashram life, least carbon emission he and his men and women in the ashram would do, is actually the basis of the modern environmental movement and ideology in post-Gandhian era. So you can give one or two lines about Gandhi's impact on environmental movement in India, because all the great environmentalists after independence, you take it Sundarlal Bahuguna, you take it Medha Patekar, and you take it this Ganga Devi and others, they all admired Mahatma Gandhi. That is because Gandhian lifestyle and the environmental objectives are very much in unison. Initially, the Indian environmentalists started movement against big companies, but later on they focused on water, flora, fauna, biodiversity, deforestation, river pollution, etc. Quite often there is a debate that development is actually good for overall modernization of a country. But this debate, development of what type, development for whom, natural resources is always limited. How we are smartly, judicially using, that is very important. So that is the basis of most of the movement. Chipko movement in 1973 onwards is a very famous. Most importantly, women were, in forefront, and you all know the very famous Sundarlal Bahuguna, Ganga Devi, Gauri Devi, etc. And they started hugging the trees when the contractors and the people who started coming and cutting the trees, leading to deforestation, flood, landslides, etc. And men in those pahad or those hills were mostly outside the villages, but the women who were dependent for their fuels, now they had to walk 5 kilometers. They were not allowed because of the laws they passed in 1840s and 85, helping the contractors to get benefits of this forest. So this entire debate between modern capitalist economy, state, the contractors, and the importance of wood in the cities for your furnitures and for railways in the British, that is linked with this entire movement. Then you can mention about Narmada Bachao Andolan, very famous since mid 1980s, led by Medha Patekar, because they claimed, and of course it is true, that there were villages after villages which were submerged in the water, and those people had to migrate. Compensation, yes, given, but I always say that compensation can be given of house, cannot be given of home. House is made of your eat pathar, and home is made of rishte, jazbaat, muhabbat. This people of outside, people who are contractors, may not understand that the villagers, the tribals, the forest dwellers, they love the nature, they love the trees, they love everything around their forest. And suddenly somebody came and started taking their entire world, their entire culture, their entire life. And obviously you would find different types of reactions and movement in tribal areas and other areas. So Sardar Sarovar Dam became very controversial during the 80s and 90s, and the matter went to Supreme Court. That you don't have to go into that detail. Another famous was Silent Valley movement since 1986, Nilgiri, Kerala, again for the same purpose. So the point is this, that these popular movements, you can mention few of them, actually raise that what is the real crisis of environment in India. Otherwise, the government and the urban people and the media would not have given attention, and like in Uttarakhand, many regulations were passed to ban many such cutting of the trees could not have happened. And the way the speed at which the dams construction had started after independence, like Bhakra Nangal Dam and Tehri Dam, that could have continued. So that got a big check, and that was all thanks to the popular movement, that development got a new orientation. The very meaning of development started changing from the 1970s and 80s. And then we realized that Ministry of Forest and Environment in India became more sensitive. The forest officials are today more sensitive than the forest officials, say, in post-independent India and just before independence, because they were always looking from government side or from the contractor side. Now the government is also more sensitive thanks to all these popular movements. This is the approach of this question. So I hope that whatever we discussed, you understood it. The point was that this exam is very much gettable provided your preparation is on track, provided you understood every topic of history in totality and do not try to mug up in a traditional manner, because the questions in UPSC would be always thoughtful. In our classes, we discuss all the aspect and then we give notes, handouts, tell very few books which is very popular in history like Bipan Chandra, Sumit Sarkar, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay. One or two standard book is enough as far as civil service is concerned. It is not an academic exam, but understanding the topic, the theme in totality till its rock bottom, So that when the question is designed and asked, you take 2 minutes to think, plan it in your mind, write in rough pages, and start writing. This exam is a very beautiful exam. So enjoy this exam with us here at Vajiram. Thank you very much.